garden. I started working at the garden in 1983, shortly after I got my PhD at the University of Michigan, and I went there to study a couple of specific groups of plants, including the tree of heaven family, which is the tree of heaven is the tree that grows in Brooklyn in that book. But once I got there, I had the opportunity in 1985 to go on an expedition to Brazil and fell in love with studying the forest there and working in that country. And in 1990, I started working in the Atlantic coastal forests of Brazil, the other forests of Brazil. Everybody knows about the Amazon, but along the coast of the eastern coast of Brazil, there's another fringe of forests that's where all the people live, and it's greatly endangered, and half the species there occur nowhere else. So it not only from a scientific point of view was interesting, but also from a conservation standpoint. This was an endangered forest type, considered one of the hot spots for conservation in the world because of its deforestation, high numbers of species, and high numbers of species that occur nowhere else. So if the forests are gone, those species disappear from the world.
So does the botanical gardens sponsor programs to preserve the environment around the world, in addition to providing visitors with a chance to enjoy nature here in the Bronx?
There's a hidden aspect to the garden. The garden is sort of built on a triangle of the beauty of the garden, education, and scientific research. And scientific research is sort of the least visible aspect of the garden's triangle of things that happen there. And there's a core of 25 PhD scientists who study all aspects of plant biology, primary one of which is we still don't know all the plants that are out there. In tropical America, probably 20% of the species don't have names. So we still need to go there and figure out what is there and tease those out apart from the other things that do have names, give them names, and then those data can be much more useful for conservation. If we have the names and we know what the species are, we can more wisely conserve the areas they occur in.
And then when you have exhibits periodically during the year, does the research that you have, do you transport some of the plants from around the world to the Bronx so people could enjoy it?
Yes, some of them, yes, and others less so. When we have orchid exhibits, then we use the scientific skills of our staff to enrich those. And when we have exhibits that focus on a certain part of the world, we will use the expertise of our staff. Next summer, not this summer, but next summer, we will have an exhibition on a very famous Brazilian landscape architect. And so all of our Brazilian expertise, including myself, will be involved in helping enrich that program for the public.
So when people make donations to the New York Botanical Gardens, part of it is going not only to keep the garden beautiful, but for research.
Yes.
That is, that is great. And I don't think a lot of people, like you said, I don't think a lot of people realize that they're contributing to a healthier environment.
Yeah, no, the work of the garden is fundamental to wise conservation, because we need to know what's there, not only in the tropics, but locally too. We have a very strong program in understanding the flora of northeastern U.S. and the New York region. And this involves identifying invasive species, where they're coming from, where they're going, what are the factors that make them invade, those kinds of things.
And you had mentioned that the forests in Brazil are among the most diverse?
That's correct, yes. Probably the most diverse forests in the world are those of the western Amazon, bordering Peru and Ecuador and Colombia. But the forests of the coastal Brazil, where I work, are also extremely diverse. We found in 1 hectare, that's 2.5 acres of forest, over 450 species of trees in this 1 hectare, and that's way more the species of trees than you find in all of the eastern United States.
Well, and it's also very, there's a risk that the forests are shrinking, and some of the plant life could be on the verge of being extinct.
That's absolutely true. In the Atlantic forests, the reason it was designated one of the world's hot spots for biodiversity is because less than 8% of the forests remain standing. And that means that all these species that are currently there have to be preserved in this remaining 8% of the landscape.
When you're doing work on conservation, is there any work to reintroduce species that have gone extinct to try to bring them back in some way?
That's a really interesting question. We're doing that with, I'm working with some organizations that are doing that with a wood called Brazil wood or Pernambuco. And this is the wood that is used to make high quality concert level violin bows because it's a musical wood, it's a tone wood. And it's a beautiful tree. And in the past, it was used in colonial times. It was chopped down and chopped up and boiled to get red aniline dye. And so the tree was devastated, wiped out. But it's also a beautiful wood for construction.
We have to take a break now.
Okay, we'll come back.
We'll definitely come back. And my guest is Wayt Thomas, who's with the New York Botanical Gardens. And we're talking about the gardens as well as the dangers of plants shrinking, being extinct, and our shrinking forests in Brazil and around the world.
WVOX from Westchester and now all over the world.
1460 WVOX.
Now back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenberg Town Supervisor.
I'm David Bach. I'm the co-host. And Paul, before we continue, I still had one more question I would like to ask. We were talking about the work you do for conservation and how you reintroduce some species to try to bring them back. You were talking about
I was talking about Brazil wood.
the Brazilian wood. My question is, how do you reintroduce a species of trees? Because it takes them kind of so long to grow. How would you reintroduce a species of trees into an area?
Well, there's two strategies that my people we work with are doing. It's an organization called Floresta Viva in the state of Bahia, Brazil, and they're growing seedlings of this tree, and then they're replanting them. They're replanting them in disturbed forest to increase the richness of the forest, and they're also growing them in plantations so that there's wood in the future that can be used to be harvested for violin bows, so they don't have to take trees out of the natural forest.
What got you interested in tropical forests and Brazil?
Well, that's a good question. My dad was a diplomat, and I grew up a lot of my life in Southeast Asia. My father, a diplomat, a foreign service diplomat, normally every 2 to 3 years they move from one country to another. So when I at the age of 1.5, my father was assigned to Thailand, and then 3 years later to Taiwan, where he learned Chinese, and then we moved around all of Southeast Asia. So, and he loved to watch birds, so he'd take us out in the woods, and I loved it. So I was born a naturalist of some kind, and then I started working with plants, and I just love that. Love to figure out what things are, and so just started from day one.
I know in Westchester, every time you do some plantings, the deer, they eat them. And do we have a similar problem in, say, Brazil, where animals are having an impact on plants?
Brazil is not so much of a problem because people will hunt animals to eat. And in Westchester, lucky for the deer, hunting is extremely difficult. So I think in Brazil, if they saw a deer walking through their woods, it would have a good chance of being dinner. And that's one of the problems for preserving species in the wild, because there's always people looking, because there's so many people that are poor and need to look for protein to eat.
If there's a bunch of environmentalists in Westchester County, and would you have any advice what we could do to preserve some of the species and plants here?
Last fall, there was a forum in Hastings on the deer problem in Hillside Woods, which is a woodland area shared by Hastings and Dobbs Ferry. And I spoke to that, and fundamentally, the deer population is 10 times the carrying capacity. So all the natural woodland life is being eaten by the deer, particularly in the winter, so that there's very little chance for us to have a natural forest there until we can deal with the deer population.
And what's your experiences with the bird population? Are you worried about birds becoming extinct?
In Hastings?
Or anywhere?
The birds, when you preserving forests in Brazil or in the northeastern U.S., requires you to think in terms of the whole ecosystem. So you can't just preserve the trees; you have to preserve the herbs, the animal life too, so that you have a full functioning ecosystem. And if you start degrading that, you'll lose populations at all levels, whether it's birds or mammals or worms or spring wildflowers. In Brazil, there's what's an ecological hotspot? What does that mean? An ecological hotspot, a hotspot for biodiversity, is an area that has a high species diversity, a high number of species that occur nowhere else, and is under threat from deforestation or hunting or agriculture.
In terms of the area that you've studied, in Brazil, what's how many miles, and how do you go about your studying?
The Atlantic forest is huge. It extends the eastern coast of Brazil extends the equivalent of Nova Scotia to Cuba. So you can't study all of that. It's not all the same thing. No one would consider that the forests in Cuba are the same as the forests in Nova Scotia. But in Brazil, they're all called the Atlantic forest. So what I focus on is one part of it in the state of Bahia, which no one knows about Bahia here, but it's the state size of France. And the area that's along the coast is really, really diverse and is highly impacted by people moving in, deforestation, logging, those kinds of things.
What made you pick Brazil in this specific area?
I had gone to this part of Brazil a couple of times to look for a certain species that I studied. And when we went there looking for the species, we would collect other plants too. And we'd find that, wow, we just went in the forest off the side of the road and we got a plant that's new to science, or a plant that hasn't been collected in 100 years. We shouldn't be doing that so easily. This should be better studied, but it hadn't been studied that well. So there was so much to learn. So I got very, very interested in that and was able to get in 1990 a grant from the MacArthur Foundation to start studying that forest.
That's so interesting. Is the federal government in Brazil very supportive of your initiatives to preserve the species? And I know Brazil's had a lot of problems recently.
Brazil has a lot of problems recently, but maybe it's better to think of it as a huge country like the U.S. with pros and cons, so that you can't always think in terms of just one. Everybody wants to do this. Everybody wants to use chainsaws, or everybody wants to preserve the forest. It goes back and forth. There's parties that go both ways.
We have to take a break, and we'll be back in a couple minutes. And this is a really interesting interview with Wayt Thomas, who resides in Hastings and is a curator at the New York Botanical Gardens in in the Bronx. And should mention that there's an exhibit that's ending, I think, this weekend at the Botanical Gardens. So this is a great weekend to visit the garden. It's really spectacular. Closest thing to heaven, I guess, south of the Greenberg Nature Center.
1460 WVOX.
Now back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenberg Town Supervisor, and it's an honor to interview Wayt Thomas. And Wayt is New York Botanical Gardens, which is located in the Bronx. But Wayt does a lot of travel and has been studying the floral life in Brazil. And the question I had is, in Brazil, does the Brazilian government support your efforts, and do they fund any efforts to preserve the forestry and to try preventing the extinction of plants?
Our work, I always work with Brazilian colleagues, and when I'm in Brazil, I try and take a back seat and let my Brazilian colleagues, scientists, work with the Brazilian government. It's much easier for a Brazilian to work with the Brazilian government to affect change there than for some gringo to come in and say, this is what you ought to be doing. So I try and do that in a more low key way, diplomatic way.
That's why
exactly.
it's worth having a curator whose father was a diplomat.
It's a good way to do things. It's the best way, and I think that our research in Southern Bahia has directly resulted in some very large state parks, and I think indirectly in the establishment of several national parks.
The other question I had is, does the United Nations or any other world environmental organizations provide funding?
No, I think through the Global Environmental Facility, they do fund environmental work in Brazil, but it's in a more general way and hasn't gotten to the areas I've worked in yet.
Do you think that the world community should be more involved in preserving our forestry? Are we doing enough? And is this something that should be on the agenda of members of Congress?
I believe so. I think that last year the famous biologist and conservationist E.O. Wilson published a book in which he stated that we needed to preserve half of our landscape, and we're a long way from that. But if you think in terms of the ecological benefits we get from intact ecosystems, the way that that rainwater is captured in the Adirondacks, for instance, not only captured but captured in a clean way, and this works throughout ecosystems. The salt marshes filter water to the ocean, so intact ecosystems are really important for our livelihood on the long term.
Yeah, I just had another thought. We read so much about global warming, and how has global warming impacted the plant life around Brazil and around the world? And is that contributing to the extinction, or what's the biggest causes of the threat of extinctions? I
think global warming in the tropics is not so much an increase in temperature, but it's change in climate patterns. So areas that were rainy are getting drier and vice versa, so that the climate changes locally, and this will affect the existence of scarce species that are sort of on the edge. And in the tops of mountains all over the world, there's a lot of species that are isolated on mountaintops that are only found there. And as the mountains get warmer, that cool area at the top of the mountain in which these species occur will disappear, and those species may disappear also.
As part of your studies, do you also investigate like insect life that might impact the plants? Is that sort of like is that an issue?
Yeah, I try and look at the plants in order to help. The plants are a framework for all life in intact ecosystems, forests or grasslands. So everything revolves around the plants, whether it's deer eating plants or bee pollinating plants taking nectar away. They all function around plants. And so I work with Brazilians who study pollination because they need someone that knows the plant side.
So you probably would be very pleased to note that the town of Greenberg, we just authorized beekeeping.
I think that's excellent.
Could you just mention, so this way when people are yelling at me for doing that, I could give them a better...
I think bees are endangered. There's too many pesticides being used, and it's compromised the ability of bees to survive easily. Not only honeybees, but all the native species of bees that are also extremely important for pollination. And I may put in a beehive in my own yard.
Oh, that's great. It was interesting because somebody suggested it to us about 8 or 9 months ago, and we just passed the legislation about 2 weeks ago.
Oh, excellent. That's
So
great. But you can also not only have a hive for honeybees, you can buy little houses for solitary bees that are basically holes in a piece of wood. It's very simple to do.
That's great. The MacArthur Foundation has helped fund some of your work.
Yeah, this was in 1990, so quite a while ago. They had a program where they focused on the different hotspot areas of the world, and in that time one of them was the Atlantic forest. They also have they were focused on the Caribbean, Madagascar, various important biodiversity areas throughout the world. And so they were very good to support me for 9 years for that work.
How many different species are there, in Brazil, in southern Brazil? About.
Brazil has almost 40,000 species of plants. It's the most diverse country in the world for plants, followed shortly by Colombia. But in southern Brazil, I don't know the distinction of how the diversity is divided, but it's extremely diverse.
And from when you started your work, have you seen, how has things changed? What's been the progress or the disappointments in the past since you started?
Much like the U.S., there's been a raising of the consciousness and the importance of conservation of biological diversity. I think in Brazil, the most important moment was when they hosted the Convention of Biological Diversity in 2002, I think it was. And that sort of, the whole country focused on that and became aware of this in a way they hadn't before. There's still, big divisions in the country like there are here. Some people want to conserve, others want to turn it all into soybeans. So it goes, you've got this dynamic tension.
Is this also something that is kind of looked at? You have this, you said you had this big event in 2002. Is this something that they did once and then people kind of paid attention to it for a little bit and then forgot about it? Or is this something that should happen more often?
I think This was an international meeting that happens every 6 years or so, and this really educated the country, and they haven't moved back from it. They're still the kids learned about that, and they haven't forgotten.
We have to take another break, and I'll be right back. And we're interviewing Wayt Thomas, Elizabeth G. Britton, curator of botany at the Institute of Systematic Botany at the New York Botanical Gardens. So we'll be right back in a couple minutes. Thanks.
WVOX, America's great community station.
1460 WVOX.
Now back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good. I'm Paul Feiner. I'm Greenberg Town Supervisor, and my guest is Wayt Thomas, who is really has a very, very interesting life studying plants and species all over Brazil and around the world. What's the sedges? What does that mean?
Sedges are a group of plants that look a whole lot like grasses and grow in wet areas. Sedges you would know include papyrus, Chinese water chestnut, and if you've ever been to the Everglades, all the sawgrass there is a sedge.
Now, you were talking about the hundreds of different species in Brazil, and how many species, if somebody went to like a forest in New York or in Westchester, would they generally be able to find if they're lucky?
If you went into a forest in Westchester, normally you'd probably find about 10 species of trees. You've got several different species of oaks, a couple different species of maples, ash, so on and so forth. But in a similar forest in Brazil, you're probably in 150, 200 species of trees in the same area in a couple of acres, you know.
During the break, I asked one of my stupid questions. I guess I wanted to know if communities like Greenberg could almost take some plants, and you mentioned that you can't because of our weather conditions. Obviously, the plants can't grow, when it's freezing or whatever. If there's a greenhouse, they would be able to grow, right?
Yeah, the New York Botanical Garden, for instance, has a greenhouses that aren't open to the public where they preserve living plants. And one of the ones that they have gotten that I was able to collect live years ago is a species called Anomacloa, which is the world's most primitive grass. And it only occurs in an area about the size of this radio studio.
Wow.
What would be the next step to get more people aware of this and more people helping out your cause? Would it be more funding? Would it be more massive conferences? Would it be specific events? What would be the next step in getting more help? I would say.
More help for conservation?
Conservation, reintegration of extinct species, slowing down of deforestation, those type of things.
I think basically more funding is a critical thing, but you need to preserve more areas of forest, and this needs to be done hand in hand with local governments in the concerned countries. Raise the capacity of local NGOs who might be stewards to those lands, and also more funding for research in biodiversity, understanding biodiversity, because we can't really do a complete job till we know what we're trying to conserve.
How would you convince somebody, let's say I'm talking to somebody here and they don't care about like some grass that dies over in Brazil. How would you convince somebody that this is an important endeavor to take?
Well, I study an esoteric group of plants, but the person that when oil companies realized that diatoms were the indicator for oil-bearing soils, they said, "Oh my God, who knows about diatom?" It was some science nerd off and studying these useless but very pretty fossil organisms. So in that case, the knowledge that some scientists had that was quote unquote useless knowledge became extremely useful. The same for the guy who studied ticks. And also, okay, well, what do you know about Lyme disease? So we go find out about these little ticks that weren't important, but now are. But I think more importantly, we should know about what's going on in the world in general, and maybe that'll become important in the future, maybe not. But we should know. And now that genomics is becoming so important, our ability to analyze DNA and genes, having all this genetic material available in intact ecosystems, whether it's animals or plants or microbes or invertebrates, sometimes in fungi, these may become very important antibiotics in the future, but we won't know in the future unless we're able to conserve them now.
How come the botanical gardens doesn't make some of the exhibits, public? You mentioned that there's a species that is almost extinct, some grass, and you were able to bring it to a greenhouse in the Bronx. And why wouldn't the public be able to see it?
Well, it's not particularly beautiful. It doesn't have a flower. It's just
Right.
a grass, and grass flowers are very inconspicuous. But also sometimes when you move the plants from there, the conditions in the non-public greenhouse to a public greenhouse, those conditions in the public greenhouse are not quite the same, and you may not be able to maintain that plant safely.
So, like a typical greenhouse, say at the Greenberg Nature, say if you have one at a Greenberg Nature Center, or you have one, we have one at the Greenberg at Hartsbrook Nature Conserve, Cornell Cooperative. There's different types of greenhouses, and some are more elaborate than others.
Well, you have to have the exact microclimate. How cold does it get at night? How warm is it during the
I
day?
didn't even realize that.
The humidity level. So if you're trying to grow fuchsias that like it cold at night, or orchids that like it cool at night, that probably wouldn't work for this plant that likes it warm all the time.
If people are like walking around inside a greenhouse, could that impact the survival of the
Yeah,
plant?
with the doors opening and closing too. Yeah.
Oh, I never knew that. It's interesting because when I was in high school and college, I took science classes, and I never really appreciated it. And now all of a sudden, I'm so fascinated by science. So
Well, there's going to be an open house at the Botanical Garden. I think it's this weekend for science, and so there's some nice scientific exhibits that are open to the public.
that is great. If some of our listeners either have students or themselves, if they want to go into the field, what advice would you give them?
Start local, and then you can branch out. You learn what you have locally, because spending your time outdoors wherever you are will be enriching and educational. And then if you learn what you have locally, and then you're way ahead in expanding your horizons to some tropical forest.
And also I wanted to mention, I was reading your bio, which is extremely impressive. I would never argue with a PhD from the University of Michigan, but you've written a lot, and you've had a lot of publications.
Part of my job as a scientist at the Botanical Garden is to publish my observations and results, and we do that in scientific journals. And part of that is publishing descriptions of species new to science, so that we are recording this undiscovered diversity, or bringing together all the information on a group of plants. So it might be the tree of heaven family, all the species we know about it and how they differ one from another.
And we're unfortunately running out of time. Is there anything else you'd like to mention? And also, are you optimistic about the future or so pessimistic?
I'm always optimistic. I think we have to have a positive outlook on things to move ahead and try and understand and conserve the world's biodiversity.
This is really fascinating. I'm so honored that you took the time out of your busy schedule to join us. And I definitely learned a lot. And I'm now really excited to go to the botanical gardens in the Bronx this weekend. I've always loved it. I went to Fordham, so
Actually, it's right across the street.
We were across the street, so I always enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here, and you do a great job. I'm a big fan of yours.
Thank you very much. And anytime you have advice about the town and what we could do to preserve nature and what we could do to reduce the impact of poor environmental decisions, please call me.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenberg Town Supervisor. We'll speak to everybody next week.